I hope you're well. So about 4 years ago, I did a video about guide rail compatibility, and 4 years is a long time, even in a developed market like track saws. So I figured it was time for a 2024 update. Guide rails or tracks are an essential part of a track saw or plunge saw, and alongside perhaps a blade change, they're often one of the first purchases that a new user will want to make. At the risk of stating the obvious, if you want 100% compatibility with the rails that come with your saw, you should buy the same again. Disappointingly though, many smaller manufacturers and retailers don't offer aftermarket rails for their saws, which is where the compatibility concerns come in, because nobody wants to make an expensive mistake. Festool patented their style of guide rail with the cut-through splinter guard in 1981, and as such it's become a kind of de facto standard for guide rails. Mafell went their own way with their guide rail design, and they also make the rails for the Bosch plunge saw. Other manufacturers have also done their own thing. DeWalt and Einhell have a rail with splinter guards on both edges, albeit for different reasons. Makita had the original variation of the Festool pattern with an anti-tipping lip, and this is one of the most widely copied by companies like Triton, Titan, McAllister and Rutland's for their cordless saw. Milwaukee too have a variation on that variation as well. Metabo also went their own way with a design that aims to combine the convenience of a Mafell and Bosch alike joining plate. And then there's companies like Evolution with their recently announced G2 guide rails and joining bars that aim to replicate the Festool pattern as closely as possible. In fact, let's take a minute to remind ourselves about the Festool rail and see what the fuss is really all about. The guide rail is a piece of extruded aluminium, 183 millimeters wide, with a 16 millimeter wide and a 6.5 millimeter high rib that the saw locates on. Beneath that rib is a T-slot used principally for clamping. There's also a pair of grippy neoprene strips under the rail to help keep it in place. To the left of the rib is an upward-facing T-slot of the same dimensions that can be used for clamps and accessories like rail stops or parallel guides. And either side of the rib is a low-friction glide strip that the saw base plate bears against. The replaceable splinter guard is attached to the underside of the right-hand edge of the rail with double-sided tape, and it overhangs the rail by a few millimeters. It's designed to be trimmed back initially to give a clear indication of the cut line, though over time this will be subject to wear, so the splinter guard is designed to be easily replaced. Now, as I say, Festool patented this in 1981, so that patent has long expired, and always assumed that there was some kind of residual intellectual property or design rights that they retained, as nobody had made an exact copy of the Festool pattern. Until this year, that is, when Evolution launched their G2 guide rails a few months back. Now, to be absolutely clear, I partnered with Evolution to help promote the recent launch of their new saws and rails. This video is not part of any promotion. I purchased all the rails that you see in this video, and I have no financial interest in any of these products beyond providing Amazon affiliate links in the video description, which is supplied as a convenience for you to use or not. Now, there are so many plunge saws and rails available these days, I can't hope to cover them all, and I will be doing a 2024 entry-level plunge saw roundup in the next few weeks. But let's take a quick look at the rails from the original supermarket saw, and that's Lidl's Parkside. The Parkside rail pattern is pretty common amongst many of this style of entry-level saw. The Rutland's corded saw, the Lumberjack and XL saws all come with a similar rail, and it's slightly narrower than the standard Festool rail with no T-slot on the left-hand side. Instead, the rail is turned into a sort of C shape. The distance between the rib and the splinter guard is pretty consistent between the Parkside and the Festool, so they will join together without too many issues, though the lack of a second T-slot in the Parkside means that only one joining bar can be used, and that makes using homemade accessories like rail stops or parallel guides more challenging. We also get a slightly odd overhang moving from one to the other, though it doesn't seem to get in the way. I must give an honourable mention to Lidl as well for supplying additional rails, albeit two 700mm lengths, and you do have to order from Germany, but they will do it, and at a pretty reasonable price too. You will of course end up with 4 sections of rail, so 3 joins to cut a full sheet, which isn't ideal. Let's move up market a little to Makita rails. These are a close copy of the Festool rails, but with the addition of an anti-tipping lip to the left side T-slot. I want to take a minute to talk about this, as it does seem to be widely misunderstood as to what this is for. It is not to help you make accurate bevel cuts with the saw over at 45 degrees. There's far too much play in it for that. It was introduced as a unique selling point by Makita, simply to stop your saw tipping over off the rail when you reach the end of a bevel cut. Anti-tipping lip, there's a clue in the name right there, so please don't try and use this as a guide for bevel cuts, as you'll come away distinctly disappointed. As I said earlier, the Makita pattern is the most widely copied, and saws from Titan, Triton, McAllister, Erbauer and the recent Rutland's cordless saws, to name a few, all use this type of guide rail. Unfortunately, if you have one of the entry-level saws that have the same C-shaped guide rail as the Parkside, you'll probably find that your saw won't run on these Makita style rails, as the base on those saws is typically a little bit wider and it catches on that anti-tipping lip. Until recently, this was a real headache for anyone with one of those saws who wanted additional rails, as the Makita pattern was the most widely available from third parties. But now we have the Evolution G2 rails, as close a copy of the Festool rails as you'll find anywhere, and at a great price of 100 quid or so for a pair of 1.4 meter rails, joining bars, clamps and a bag too. Now, spending 100 quid on a pair of rails when you've only spent 75 or so on a saw may seem extravagant, but it means that those rails become an investment and will stay with you if you upgrade to a better saw at a later date. The G2 guide rails with the grey glide strips are a big upgrade from the original orange Evolution rails, and they are my third-party rails of choice here in 2024. Let's round this video out by looking at some of the proprietary rails that some saws come with. The Metabo sits between the Festool and Mafell in terms of size, and as I mentioned earlier, it has joining plates that are more like the Mafell and Bosch system. The rails are compatible with Festool saws, though they lack the upward-facing T-slot, so accessories will be harder to attach. The Milwaukee rail, company colours aside, is very similar to the Makita, but it has the top edge of the anti-tipping lip angled. This gives it a nice looking profile, but that's all. Use one of the wider based saws with this rail and you'll find that they catch on the lip, just like the Makita rails. The Einhell guide rail is unique as far as I know, in that it has not just two splinter guards, one on each edge, but two ribs on the rail as well. The idea of this is that you use one side of the rail for cuts at 90 degrees and the other for bevel cuts at 45 degrees. This is one way of getting around the issue with some saws where the cut line doesn't stay consistent as you angle the saw over. I bought the Einhell saw recently as well, and I'll be taking a look at that soon. The DeWalt rail is the other double-edged track, though intended as a convenience for when you're working in tight spaces, a kitchen or bathroom, they say, where turning the rail around would be just too much trouble. It goes without saying, I hope, that neither of these rails are compatible with any others, and the lack of an upward-facing T-slot on the rail makes adding in accessories like parallel guides or rail squares a real headache. Both of these saws will run on Festool and Evolution rails, though. And finally, we've got the Mafell and Bosch pattern rails. These rails are narrower and have an underside T-slot closer to the splinter guard, so good for clamping narrow pieces. The joining bars are more like joining plates and use a cam to clamp and align the rails together. It's an excellent way of joining rails, but bear in mind that you do need proprietary rail clamps to fit in those tiny underside T-slots. Unlike the DeWalt and Einhell tracks, the lack of a left side upward-facing T-slot on the rail makes adding accessories much more complex than it really should be. So that's my guide rail roundup for 2024. As I said earlier, this isn't a comprehensive look at all the rails available from all manufacturers, and most saws will run on Festool pattern rails like the Evolution G2. But I think I've covered the majority of commonly available ones, certainly here in Britain. But if you know of any that I haven't covered specifically, let me know in the comments below and I'll add it to my list for next time. I'll call this one done for this week though. Thanks so much for taking a look. As always, leave a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.